Morning, folks. This will be the third response to the ego and its own. This time, it's on the ancients, the first section of the second chapter, Men of the Old Time and the New, of part first, Man. Here, Stirner lays down his characterization of what he calls the ancients, those who preceded the modern man, or the Christian man. And first thing to note is I find it interesting, Stirner's sense of time here, how it colors his, to put it bluntly, his sense of old and new, as this chapter is Men of the Old Time and the New. And it's what I find fascinating is, as a traditionalist myself, I tend to advocate Christianity for Christian society. Even though I'm not one myself, I believe a society rooted in firm Christian principles to be superior, and I find that to be the traditional way. But Stirner, he would call that the modern way, tradition. Of course, he doesn't use the word tradition. The old way, he goes towards the ancients. And to some extent, it's not hard to see why. I mean, after all, the one that preceded the other would, of course, be the modern one relative towards the other, but I think the way Stirner uses the term modern, we have to go back towards his previous section, his previous chapter, A Human Life, wherein he details how in childhood we start out very materialistic centered, very without spirit, I guess. Because the way he talks about children is almost identical to the way he talks about the ancients. He says they are without spirit is not the best way to put it, but that they are not pure spirit. That's a better way, because after all, that how he characterizes the difference between children and youths is that the youth is concerned primarily with spirit, with pure spirit, whereas children are more concerned with the physical world, overcoming it and mastering it. And that's basically how he describes the difference between the ancients and the Christians. The ancients are more concerned with the physical world, and the Christians more so with the spirit. It should also be noted that the Jews are being put into the same category of the ancients, that category being materialistic metaphysical philosophy. Now, admittedly, I don't know a great deal about ancient Greek metaphysical philosophy, but given that they believe that the gods resided on top of a mountain that exists in real life, but they could not see the top of it, I can definitely understand why the Greeks seem to be more materialistic than those of the Abrahamic faiths, who adhered more to a God that existed outside our very observed reality. I can definitely understand why Stirner lumps the Jews and the ancients together. I mean, after all, their afterlives, their theories on what the afterlife holds for us, is fairly similar, especially given the Sadducees, the comparison between them and the ancients. The Sadducees are the older version of the Jews. I don't know. Their view of the afterlife was very similar to that of the ancient Greeks. The Greeks, of course, as most you know, they believed that after death your soul roamed in the river of Styx. And this would go on presumably for eternity. The Sadducees did not believe the exact same thing, but they believed in a very similar place. I don't remember its name, but it's sort of a holding place for your soul. It may not have been a river, but it was a general gathering of souls in that sense. The Pharisees went a bit further and ushered in the notion of the reincarnation of the soul, particularly when the Messiah would return. And I bring up the Pharisees because, in a way, trying to go with Max Stirner's progression of a human life, starting from childhood, going to youth, and then becoming a man, I guess you could say that the Pharisees in this analogy would be the baby steps that one would take from Judaism towards Christianity, or towards modernity, if we were to use Max Stirner's language specifically. So I'm trying to understand the very basic psychology that Stirner just took the last chapter to establish and is now trying to use history to prove a very basic point. Because the next chapter is the moderns, i.e. that's the Christians. And I want to know exactly how he envisions pure spirit to be. He already hinted in it in his description of the youth in chapter on a human life. And he's already expanded on how the ancients exhibit that childlike sense of materialism. For instance, the mind is conceived by the ancients as a weapon against the world, as children use deception and trickery. To the Greeks, education is just as important as health and material well-being, because it is the means you use to acquire the latter goals. We can see this pattern repeated with the Jews, where education is highly important for securing health and material well-being, which are also very important goals in Judaism as well. By contrast, Christianity believes education to be most important not with the material disciplines, as with math and science or economics, but with one's spiritual education. And while the church was instrumental in setting up the monasteries that educated most of the populace in the medieval ages, its main purpose in educating the populace was to make them ready to enter the kingdom of heaven. And also it should be noted that Christianity tends to be very universal in its application of its principles to all humans, Christian and non-Christian alike. Judaism and the ancient Greeks, on the other hand, tend to be far more tribalistic in their doctrines, which falls in line directly with what Max Stirner was saying about natural bonds. After all, tribal comes from tribes, which are an extended family, and willingness to do more to acquire more material well-being and health for one's family and for one's extended family, i.e. their tribe or community, would be being far more a materialistic doctrine than that which is concerned with all things, because all things are the property of God, the Spirit, the pure Spirit. So from what I can tell about ancient Greek and Jewish religions, ideology, whatnot, I would say I probably agree more with Stirner than I disagree with him, though I'm curious to see how this train of thought then transcends towards the modern Christian thinking. And I guess we'll discover that in the next chapter, so see you there.